The rain hammered against the weathered wooden planks of Ezra Thompson's farmhouse like bullets from heaven, each drop carrying the fury of the Wyoming storm that had been brewing since sunset. At 72, Ezra had weathered countless storms in his half-century on this land, but tonight felt different. The wind howled through the gaps in his barn walls, and lightning split the darkness with an intensity that made his old bones ache. Ezra sat by his stone fireplace, mending a bridle by the flickering light of an oil lamp. His calloused hands, marked by decades of hard work, moved with practiced precision despite the arthritis that plagued his joints. The isolation of his ranch, 20 miles from the nearest town of Cedar Falls, had become both his sanctuary and his burden. Since his wife Martha passed 3 winters ago, the silence had grown heavier, broken only by the lowing of his cattle and the creak of aging wood. The knock came so softly at first that Ezra thought it was just another branch scraping against his door. But then it came again, weak and desperate, barely audible above the storm's rage. Ezra's weathered face creased with concern as he set down his work and reached for the Winchester rifle that never strayed far from his side. In these parts, unexpected visitors after dark rarely brought good news. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice gravelly from years of shouting commands across open range. No answer came, only another feeble knock that seemed to carry the weight of exhaustion and desperation. Ezra approached the heavy oak door cautiously, his boots creaking against the worn floorboards. Through the small window beside the door, lightning illuminated a figure hunched against the storm. When he pulled back the heavy iron latch and opened the door, the sight that met him stopped his breath cold. A young woman, perhaps 25, stood swaying on his porch. Her dark hair was plastered to her head, and her simple brown dress clung to her shivering frame. But it was her condition that struck him most. Her belly was round and full with child, clearly in the final months of pregnancy. Her face, pale and drawn with exhaustion, looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of hope and terror. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the storm. I need help." Without hesitation, Ezra stepped forward and caught her arm as she began to sway dangerously. "Good Lord, woman, get inside before you catch your death." His voice, though gruff, carried the warmth of genuine concern. He guided her into his humble home, immediately struck by how small and fragile she seemed despite her pregnant state. Water dripped from her clothes onto his floor, but Ezra paid it no mind. He helped her to his only chair near the fireplace, then quickly moved to stoke the fire higher. "Name's Ezra Thompson," he said, pulling a thick wool blanket from a chest near his bed. "This here's my ranch, such as it is." He wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, noting how violently she was shivering. "Sarah," she managed through chattering teeth. "Sarah Morgan." "Well, Sarah Morgan, you're safe now," Ezra said with quiet conviction. "Let me get you some hot coffee and see about those wet clothes." As he moved about his small kitchen, preparing coffee over his wood-burning stove, Ezra's mind raced with questions. What was a pregnant woman doing out in this storm, alone and on foot? The nearest town was a hard day's ride, and he hadn't seen hide nor hair of another soul for weeks. But he'd learned long ago that people had their reasons for traveling desperate roads, and it wasn't his place to judge. The coffee ready, he poured it into his best china cup, one of the few nice things Martha had insisted on keeping. Sarah accepted it with trembling hands, holding it close to her face to breathe in the steam. "Thank you," she whispered, tears mixing with the rainwater on her cheeks. "I didn't know if I could make it much further." "How far have you traveled?" Ezra asked gently, settling onto a 3-legged stool across from her. 3 days, she replied, her voice gaining strength as warmth began to return to her body. "Maybe 4. I lost track." 3 days in her condition, in this weather. Ezra felt a surge of admiration for this young woman's determination, mixed with anger at whatever circumstances had driven her to such desperate measures. "Well, you're here now, and that's what matters," he said firmly. "You can take my bed tonight. I'll sleep in the chair." "Oh no, I couldn't." "No arguments," Ezra interrupted with the authoritative tone he'd once used to manage ranch hands. "A woman in your condition needs proper rest, especially after what you've been through." As Sarah sipped her coffee, color slowly returned to her pale cheeks. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the warm circle of firelight, she began to relax for the first time in days. Ezra busied himself preparing a simple meal of bacon, beans, and cornbread, ranch fare but hot and filling. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said as he placed the plate before her. "I want you to know, I'm not running from the law. I'm not a criminal." "Never thought you were," Ezra replied honestly. "A woman doesn't risk her life and her child's life unless she's running from something worse than the law." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed to carry relief rather than despair. "You're very kind. Just doing what any decent person would do," Ezra muttered, uncomfortable with praise. "Eat up now. You need your strength." As Sarah ate with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't seen a proper meal in days, Ezra found himself studying her more closely. Despite her current state, he could see she was a woman of some refinement. Her hands, though work-worn, weren't the hands of a common laborer. Her speech, when she wasn't exhausted, carried the careful diction of someone with education. Whatever her story was, it was more complex than a simple tale of poverty or desperation. The storm showed no signs of abating as the evening wore on. Ezra prepared his bed with clean sheets, insisting that Sarah rest while he kept watch by the fire. As she finally settled into sleep, her hand protectively covering her unborn child, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that this night would change everything. Outside, the wind howled through the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard the sound of horses. But storms played tricks with sound, and by morning he'd convinced himself it was just his imagination. He had no way of knowing that his simple act of Christian charity had set in motion events that would transform his quiet ranch into something far greater than he'd ever dreamed. Dawn broke gray and subdued over the Wyoming landscape, the storm having finally exhausted itself in the early hours. Ezra woke in his chair to the sound of Sarah moving quietly about his kitchen, and for a moment, the presence of another person in his home felt so natural that he wondered if the past 3 years of solitude had been nothing but a bad dream. "You should still be resting," he said, stretching the kinks from his back as he stood. Sarah turned from the stove where she was tending to a pan of eggs, her hair now dry and braided neatly down her back. In the morning light, Ezra could see that she was even younger than he'd initially thought, with delicate features that spoke of a genteel upbringing. "I wanted to make breakfast," she said softly. "It's the least I can do after your kindness." "You don't owe me anything," Ezra replied, but he was touched by the gesture. It had been far too long since the smell of a proper breakfast had filled his home. As they shared the meal, Sarah seemed more inclined to talk. "I haven't introduced myself properly," she said, setting down her fork. "My name is Sarah Elizabeth Morgan, and I am the widow of Captain James Morgan." The name meant nothing to Ezra, but he could see the pain that crossed her face when she spoke it. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." She paused as if weighing how much to reveal. "James died 6 months ago. A riding accident, they said, though." She trailed off, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. "Though what?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the muddy yard where puddles reflected the grey sky. "James led a group of men, good men mostly. They called themselves the Morgan Riders, and they worked as protectors, I suppose you'd say. Wealthy ranchers and mining operations would hire them when the law couldn't handle certain problems." Ezra nodded slowly. He'd heard of such groups, private militias that walked the fine line between justice and vigilantism in the territories where official law was thin or corrupt. "After James died, his brother Marcus took over," Sarah continued, her voice growing harder. "But Marcus isn't James. The men they started taking on weren't good men. The jobs they began accepting weren't about protection anymore. And you spoke against it." "I tried to." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Marcus said it wasn't a woman's place to question how the men conducted business. He said I could either accept the new way of things or—" She touched her cheek unconsciously, and Ezra saw the faint yellow remnant of an old bruise. "So you left." "I ran," Sarah corrected, her voice filled with shame. "Like a coward in the night, taking nothing but the clothes on my back and what little money I had hidden away. I've been traveling for weeks, staying in boarding houses when I could afford them, sleeping rough when I couldn't." Ezra reached across the small table and covered her hand with his weathered one. "That wasn't cowardice, girl. That was courage. Takes more strength to leave everything you know than to stay and endure." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "You don't understand. The things Marcus wanted the riders to do, the jobs he was accepting, I couldn't be part of it. But by leaving, I've dishonored James's memory. These men, they followed him into battle. Some of them died under his command, and I just abandoned them." Did your husband build the Morgan riders to become what they are now under Marcus? No, Sarah said immediately. James would be horrified. He always said that power without honor was just another form of tyranny. Then you didn't abandon his memory, Ezra said firmly. You preserved it. They spent the morning working together around the ranch. Despite her condition, Sarah insisted on helping with light chores, and Ezra found himself grateful for the company. She was intelligent and quick to learn, and her presence seemed to breathe life back into the old buildings that had felt so empty for so long. As they fed the chickens together, Sarah asked, "Have you been alone here long?" 3 years come Christmas, Ezra replied, scattering grain with practiced efficiency. My Martha passed from fever. We never had children of our own, though we tried for many years. I'm sorry, that must be terribly lonely. Ezra shrugged, but Sarah could see the pain in his eyes. Man learns to live with what life gives him, or takes away. James and I were only married 2 years, Sarah said quietly. We were trying to start a family when he died. This baby, she placed both hands on her belly. This baby is all I have left of him. Boy or girl? I don't know. I hope it's a boy. James always talked about having a son to carry on the family name. She paused. Though I suppose it won't matter now. I'll never be able to give this child the life James would have wanted. Don't be so sure about that, Ezra said. Children need love and safety more than they need money or position. Sounds to me like you've got plenty of the first two to offer. As the day wore on, Ezra found himself more and more impressed with Sarah's resilience. Despite everything she'd been through, she hadn't lost her essential kindness or her determination to build something better for her unborn child. When she laughed at one of his dry observations about his ornery rooster, the sound filled the ranch yard with a warmth it hadn't known in years. That evening, as they sat by the fire again, Sarah asked, "Mr. Thompson, may I stay here a few more days? Just until I figure out where to go next." "You can stay as long as you need," Ezra replied without hesitation. "This old place could use some life in it again. I'll pull my weight. I can cook, clean, help with the animals." "Sarah," Ezra interrupted gently, "you're welcome here not because of what you can do, but because it's right. A woman in your condition shouldn't be traveling alone, especially with winter coming on. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're brave enough to leave a bad situation to protect your child. I know you're grateful for kindness. I know you work hard and don't complain." He smiled slightly. "That's more than I know about most folks, and it's enough." As they prepared for bed, Sarah paused at the door to the bedroom. "Mr. Thompson, Ezra, there's something else you should know. About the Morgan riders." "What's that?" "They don't give up easily when they want something. And Marcus considers me property of the family now. If he finds out where I am, let me worry about that," Ezra said, his voice carrying the steel that had once made him a formidable figure in these parts. "Any man who thinks he owns another person isn't welcome on my land." Sarah nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. For the first time in months, she felt truly safe. But as she settled into sleep, neither she nor Ezra noticed the lone rider who had been watching the ranch from the ridge since dawn, or saw him turn his horse and disappear into the growing darkness, riding hard toward the east. 3 more days passed in peaceful routine, and Ezra found himself wondering how he'd managed so long without proper company. Sarah had proven herself invaluable around the ranch, her gentle presence transforming the stark functionality of his home into something that felt alive again. She'd even convinced him to let her plant some late-season vegetables in Martha's old garden plot, dormant now for 3 years. It was on the 4th morning that everything changed. Ezra was repairing a section of fence line when he noticed the dust cloud on the eastern horizon. Living alone for so long had sharpened his instincts, and something about the approaching riders immediately set his nerves on edge. There were too many of them, riding in too tight a formation, moving with too much purpose toward his isolated ranch. He dropped his tools and hurried back to the house, where Sarah was hanging wash on the line he'd strung between 2 posts. The moment she saw his expression, her face went white. "How many?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dozen, maybe more," Ezra replied grimly. "You expecting company?" Sarah's hands flew to her belly as if to protect the child within. "I told you Marcus wouldn't give up. He must have sent riders to search for me." Ezra squinted at the approaching dust cloud, now close enough that he could make out individual riders. Something about their formation nagged at him. They weren't riding like men pursuing a fugitive. They were riding like soldiers. "Sarah," he said slowly, "tell me exactly who your husband was." "I told you, he led the Morgan riders." "No," Ezra interrupted, his weathered face intense. "Tell me who James Morgan really was." Sarah's composure cracked, and for the first time since her arrival, Ezra saw real fear in her eyes. James was the son of Colonel William Morgan, who served under General Grant. The Morgan family has been military for 3 generations. James's grandfather fought in the Mexican War, his father in the Civil War. And the Morgan riders? They weren't just hired guns, Sarah admitted, her voice growing smaller. They were James's attempt to bring honor and order to the territories. Former cavalrymen, mostly, who couldn't find their place in peacetime. Good men who believed in something bigger than themselves. The pieces fell into place in Ezra's mind, like a puzzle completing itself. He'd heard whispers of the Morgan riders over the years, stories told in hushed tones in saloons and general stores. They were legendary figures, men who'd faced down entire outlaw gangs and corrupt officials with equal effectiveness. If James Morgan had been their leader— "Sarah," Ezra said urgently, "how many men followed your husband?" 50, maybe 60 at the height. But they scattered after James died. Some went back east, others headed west to California. I thought they were all gone. Apparently not all of them. The riders were close enough now that Ezra could see they wore no uniforms, but their bearing and the way they rode in perfect formation spoke of military training. At their head rode a man with iron-gray hair and a bearing that commanded immediate respect, clearly their leader. "That's Captain Daniel Hayes," Sarah breathed, recognition dawning in her voice. "He was James's second in command, but I thought he'd gone back to his family in Missouri." "Seems he didn't go far enough," Ezra muttered, checking the loads in his Winchester. "Get inside, Sarah. Whatever's about to happen, I don't want you caught in the middle." "Mr. Thompson, you don't understand. These aren't Marcus's men. These are the good ones, the ones who stayed loyal to James's memory. They're not here to hurt me." "Then why are they here?" Sarah's eyes filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief as she watched the approaching riders. I think they're here because they found out what Marcus has been doing with the Morgan name. And if they found me—" The riders slowed as they approached the ranch yard, coming to a halt just outside the fence line. Ezra stepped forward, rifle ready but not raised, positioning himself protectively in front of Sarah despite her protests. Captain Hayes dismounted with fluid grace, his men remaining in their saddles but clearly ready to act if needed. Up close, Ezra could see the man was probably in his early 50s, with scars that spoke of old battles and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Thompson, I presume," Hayes said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a career soldier. "I'm Captain Daniel Hayes, formerly of the United States Cavalry and the Morgan Riders. I believe you have someone under your protection who's very important to my men and me." "Depends on who's asking and why," Ezra replied evenly, impressed despite himself by the respect in the captain's tone. Hayes's gaze moved past Ezra to where Sarah stood in the doorway, her hand resting on the doorframe for support. "Mrs. Morgan, ma'am, it's good to see you safe." "Captain Hayes," Sarah said, stepping forward despite Ezra's protective gesture. "How did you find me?" "We've been tracking Marcus and his new recruits for weeks," Hayes replied, his jaw tightening. "When we learned what he'd done to you, what he'd been doing with the Morgan name, well, ma'am, let's just say the true Morgan Riders don't take kindly to that sort of dishonor." "The true Morgan Riders?" 23 of us, ma'am. Men who rode with your husband from the beginning, who believed in what he stood for. We've been working to track down every good man who ever wore the Morgan name, trying to figure out how to honor James's memory the right way." Ezra felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, but he kept his rifle ready. "And you think terrorizing a pregnant widow is the right way?" "Terrorizing?" Hayes looked genuinely confused. "Mr. Thompson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're not here to take Mrs. Morgan anywhere she doesn't want to go. We're here to offer our protection and to thank the man who gave shelter to our captain's widow when she needed it most." "Thank me?" Hayes's expression grew solemn. "Mr. Thompson, James Morgan saved the lives of every man here at one time or another. His widow carrying his child is the most precious thing left in this world to us. The fact that you took her in, no questions asked, when she was desperate and alone, that's the kind of honor James would have recognized." As if responding to some unspoken signal, every one of the mounted riders removed his hat in unison, a gesture of respect that spoke volumes about their discipline and their feelings toward Sarah. "We've come to ask if you'll accept our protection," Hayes continued, "for both you and Mrs. Morgan. Marcus won't give up his search, and he's got some dangerous men riding for him now. Men who don't share our scruples about harming women and children." Ezra looked back at Sarah, seeing the complex emotions playing across her face: hope, fear, gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "And if I say no?" "Then we'll respect your wishes and ride on," Hayes said immediately. "But we'll leave men to watch the area, just in case. James Morgan's child will be born free and safe, Mr. Thompson. That's a promise every man here is prepared to die for." Sarah stepped fully out of the house now, her hand still protective over her belly. "Captain, these men, they followed James, not me. Why would they risk their lives for someone who ran away?" Hayes's weathered face softened. "Ma'am, you didn't run away. You preserved the honor of the Morgan name by refusing to let it be corrupted. That takes more courage than most men possess." He gestured to his riders. "Every man here has been searching for a way to make right what Marcus has made wrong. Protecting you and the captain's child, well, that gives us purpose again." As the implications of what was happening began to sink in, Ezra realized that his quiet ranch was about to become something entirely different. The question was whether he was ready for that change, and whether he had any choice in the matter. The answer to Ezra's unspoken question came with the dawn of the next day, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the morning stillness. But this time, the riders came from the west, and their intentions were far from honorable. Marcus Morgan rode at the head of a dozen hard-faced men, their weapons gleaming in the early sunlight. Unlike Hayes and his disciplined soldiers, these men had the look of hired killers, the kind who asked no questions as long as the pay was good. Ezra had been expecting this moment since Hayes's warning the night before. The captain and his men had made camp a respectful distance from the ranch house, close enough to respond to trouble, but far enough to avoid making Sarah feel trapped. Now as Marcus's band approached, Ezra saw Hayes and his riders emerging from behind the barn where they'd been waiting. "Sarah!" Marcus's voice carried across the yard, harsh and demanding. "Enough of this foolishness! You're coming home where you belong!" Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. "I don't belong to you, Marcus. I never did." Marcus dismounted, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. He was a younger, coarser version of what Ezra imagined James might have been, handsome in a cruel way, with cold eyes that held no warmth or honor. "You're carrying a Morgan child," Marcus snarled. "That makes you Morgan property. James might have been too soft to teach you your place, but I won't make that mistake." "The only mistake here is yours," Captain Hayes said, stepping into view with his hand on his weapon. "Mrs. Morgan is under our protection now." Marcus's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of Hayes and the other riders, positioning themselves strategically around the yard. "Danny Hayes, still playing soldier, I see. James is dead, old man. Time to find a new cause." "I have found one," Hayes replied calmly. "Preserving the honor James died for." "Honor?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "Honor doesn't pay bills or put food on the table. The world's changing, Hayes. Either you adapt or you get left behind." "Some things shouldn't change," Ezra said, stepping forward with his rifle held ready. A man's word, his respect for women and children, his willingness to help a neighbor in need. Marcus's gaze shifted to Ezra with undisguised contempt. "Who asked you, old man? This is family business. You made it my business when you brought armed men onto my land to threaten a woman under my protection." The tension in the yard was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ezra could see Marcus calculating odds, weighing his dozen guns against Hayes's 23 disciplined riders. The smart play would be to back down, but Marcus's arrogance had always exceeded his intelligence. "Last chance, Sarah," Marcus called out. "Come with me now, and I'll forget this embarrassment. Stay with these fools, and I'll take you by force." "You're welcome to try," Hayes said quietly. What happened next would be talked about for years in the saloons and general stores of the territory. Without warning, Marcus drew his pistol, but before he could even raise it, Captain Hayes had moved with the fluid precision of a man who'd survived a dozen battles. His own weapon cleared leather and spoke once, the shot echoing across the yard like thunder. Marcus stumbled backward, his gun falling from nerveless fingers as he clutched his shoulder. His men, seeing their leader down and realizing they were badly outnumbered by vastly superior fighters, quickly raised their hands in surrender. "Next time I won't aim for your shoulder," Hayes said, his voice deadly calm. "Now get off this land and don't come back." As Marcus and his demoralized men retreated, nursing wounded pride as much as wounded flesh, something remarkable happened. Captain Hayes turned to face Ezra, and without a word, dropped to one knee. One by one, every other Morgan rider did the same. 23 of the finest fighting men in the territory, kneeling on Ezra's front porch in a gesture of profound respect. "Mr. Thompson," Hayes said, his voice carrying to every corner of the yard, "you sheltered Captain Morgan's widow when she had nowhere else to turn. You asked for nothing in return, expected no reward, and stood ready to defend her with your life. That's the kind of honor my captain would have recognized and respected." Ezra stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sight of these legendary men paying him homage. "I just did what any decent person would do." "Exactly," Hayes replied. "In a world where too many men have forgotten what decency means, you remembered. That makes you worthy of our loyalty." Sarah stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Ezra, these men are offering you something precious. They're offering to make this ranch a sanctuary, a place where honor still means something." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you'll have us, we'd like to build something here," Hayes explained, rising to his feet as his men did the same. "Not just a ranch, but a place where good men can find purpose again, where James's child can grow up surrounded by people who believe in the values his father died for. And Sarah would be honored to help you build that dream," Sarah said softly. "If you'll have me, this baby needs a father figure, and I need a place to call home." Ezra looked around at the faces surrounding him, weathered men who'd seen the worst the world could offer, but still believed in something better. He thought of Martha, of how she'd always wanted children to fill this house with laughter. He thought of his own lonely years, and the warmth that Sarah's presence had brought back to his life. "Well," he said finally, his voice gruff with emotion, "I reckon this old place could use some fixing up. Might need to build some extra bunkhouses, expand the barn." The cheer that went up from the Morgan riders could probably be heard in the next county. 6 months later, as Ezra held Sarah's newborn son in his weathered arms, he marveled at how completely his life had changed. The ranch now bustled with activity as the Morgan riders worked to build their sanctuary. They'd taken over protection of the entire region, bringing law and order to a corner of Wyoming that had long been forgotten by official authority. Sarah had become more than just a guest in his home. She'd become the daughter he'd never had, and her son, James Ezra Morgan, named for both his father and the man who'd given them sanctuary, was the grandchild who would carry on not just the Morgan legacy, but Ezra's as well. "You know," Sarah said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "James would have liked you. You have the same kind of quiet strength he did." "Just an old rancher who got lucky," Ezra replied, bouncing little James on his knee. "No," Sarah said firmly. "You're the man who saved us all. And this ranch, it's become exactly what James always dreamed the Morgan name could represent, a place where honor isn't just a word, but a way of life." As the stars came out over Wyoming, Ezra reflected on the strange turns life could take. A simple act of kindness on a stormy night had not only saved a woman and her child, it had restored purpose to 24 good men and given an old rancher a family he'd never dared hope for. Sometimes, he thought, the smallest gestures created the greatest changes, and sometimes opening your door to a stranger in the storm was really opening your door to destiny itself.